They say blood is thicker than water, but they forget that blood can also boil with greed and run cold with betrayal. In the houses of the wealthy, a last will and testament is rarely a final goodbye. It is often the first shot fired in a war. Outside the grand oak-paneled office of Arthur Vaughan, a gentle rain was falling, washing over the endless rows of grapevines that made up the Vaughan estate's empire. Inside, however, a storm was brewing in the suffocating silence. The air, thick with the scent of old leather and his father's lingering cigar smoke, felt heavy in Ethan Vaughan's lungs. He sat beside his two siblings, Liam and Chloe, before the mahogany desk that had been the throne of their family for 2 generations. They were not 3 children mourning a father. They were 3 predators circling a fresh kill. Liam, the eldest, wore his grief like he wore his tailored suit, a perfect, expensive facade that betrayed nothing but impatience. His polished shoe tapped a silent, rhythmic beat on the antique rug. Across from him, Chloe, ever the performer, dabbed a tearless eye with a silk handkerchief, her gaze flickering between her brothers, her mind a chessboard of calculations. And then there was Ethan, the youngest, the one who had inherited his father's passion but not his ruthlessness. He felt the chill of the room seep into his bones, a premonition of the fracture to come. Their family lawyer, Mr. Davies, a man whose face was etched with the sorrow of 1,000 family secrets, cleared his throat. He held the document that would decide their futures. He began to read, his voice a somber drone that recounted Arthur Vaughan's life and legacy. Ethan barely heard the words. His focus was on the tightening of Liam's jaw, the slight, predatory smile playing on Chloe's lips. Finally, Davies reached the operative clause. "I, Arthur Vaughan," he read, his voice steady, "do hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all shares and assets of Vaughan Estates, to be divided equally among my 3 children, Liam Vaughan, Chloe Vaughan, and Ethan Vaughan." The words hung in the air, deceptively simple. Liam's smirk widened. An equal split was a mere technicality, a starting line he was already miles ahead of. Chloe's eyes gleamed with opportunity, seeing 2 pawns she could easily play against each other. But Ethan felt no relief. He felt a cold dread wash over him. He knew his father, and his father was never simple. This equality wasn't a gift of peace, it was a test. It was a perfectly balanced battlefield, and the command to fire had just been given. The rain outside began to fall harder, and Ethan knew with absolute certainty that the storm had finally arrived. To understand the schism that was about to rip the Vaughan family apart, you have to understand the land itself and what it meant to each of Arthur Vaughan's children. Vaughan Estates was more than a business. It was a kingdom carved from the sun-drenched hills of Napa Valley. It was a tapestry of old-world legacy and new-world ambition, and each sibling saw their own reflection in its threads. For Ethan, the youngest, the kingdom was the soil itself. After the meeting with Davies concluded, he didn't return to the opulent main house, a place that now felt as cold and hollow as a mausoleum. Instead, he walked, letting the familiar crunch of gravel under his boots ground him. He went deep into the oldest part of the vineyard, to a block of Cabernet Sauvignon vines his grandfather had planted nearly a century ago. Their trunks were gnarled and thick, like ancient arthritic hands reaching from the earth. He ran his own hands over the rough bark, feeling the history, the years of sun and rain and struggle that produced the estate's most legendary wine. This was his language, the one his father had taught him. Arthur Vaughan wasn't a CEO to Ethan. He was a philosopher of the vine. He had taught Ethan not with spreadsheets, but with walks at dawn, showing him how the morning fog caressed the leaves, how the taste of the soil could predict the flavor of the grape. "A balance sheet tells you the price of a bottle," Arthur used to say, his voice a low rumble, "but the soil tells you its worth." Ethan lived in a small stone cottage on the far side of the property, a place his siblings mockingly called the gardener's shed. It was simple, filled with books on viticulture, soil charts, and the lingering scent of fermenting yeast. It was where he felt closest to his father's spirit. He was the only one who knew the names of the vineyard workers' children, the only one who shared a bottle of the finest reserve with them at the end of a long harvest. They saw him not as a boss, but as a kindred spirit, the true custodian of Arthur's legacy. They called him El Corazon, the heart of the vineyard, a heart his siblings were now preparing to cut out. Liam, on the other hand, saw only the kingdom's borders and the assets within. While Ethan walked the fields, Liam stood in their father's office, the mahogany desk already feeling like his own. He wasn't looking out at the ancestral vines. He was looking at a satellite map of the property on his tablet, his mind carving it into parcels, assigning dollar values to each acre. He paced the room, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp and clinical. He spoke a different language from Ethan, a dialect of leveraging assets, of maximizing quarterly returns, of hostile takeovers. To him, the gnarled old vines Ethan cherished were an inefficiency, a low-yield asset taking up premium real estate. His Harvard MBA had taught him that sentiment was a liability. He remembered his father, not through shared passion, but through heated arguments across this very desk, Arthur dismissing his aggressive expansion plans as soulless. "You want to build an empire of bottles, Liam," Arthur had once yelled, his face flushed with anger. "I built an empire of stories." Liam had seen that as weakness, the ramblings of an old man who couldn't adapt. The equal split in the will was, in Liam's mind, a final, posthumous insult. It was his father's last attempt to hamstring him, to force him into a partnership with the dreamy, unprofitable artist and the flighty, manipulative socialite. But Liam wasn't a partner. He was a king, and he had no intention of sharing the throne. He saw his siblings not as family, but as inconvenient shareholders he needed to sideline or absorb. His conquest had already begun. And then there was Chloe, who saw the kingdom as her personal stage and its wealth as the costuming department. She understood neither the soil nor the balance sheet, but she understood people, their vanities, their weaknesses. She was a master of appearances, a puppeteer who pulled strings with a charming smile and a well-placed whisper. After the reading of the will, she had retreated to her lavish suite in the main house, a space decorated in whites and golds that stood in stark contrast to the rustic elegance of the rest of the estate. She performed the role of the grieving daughter for about 10 minutes before picking up her phone. She wasn't calling a friend to cry. She was texting Liam, "We need to talk," before Ethan gets any foolish ideas. She saw herself as the indispensable pivot between her two brothers. She saw Liam's brutal ambition and Ethan's sentimental weakness. Her plan was to side with the stronger horse, Liam, but only in a way that made him feel he was in charge. In reality, she intended to guide his ambition, to temper his ruthlessness, just enough to avoid a public scandal, all while ensuring the corporate credit cards continued to fund her jet-setting lifestyle. Her memories of her father were transactional. He was the man who signed the checks for her art history degree in Florence, for her first apartment in Paris, for her endless wardrobe. She loved him, certainly, but in the way one loves a benevolent patron. Her loyalty was a luxury item, bestowed upon whoever could best guarantee her comfort. She found Liam in the office, pouring himself a glass of their father's best scotch. She didn't chide him for the disrespect. Instead, she came up behind him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "It's a lot to take in," she said, her voice a soft purr. "I'm worried about Ethan. He's so emotional. He might make decisions that could hurt the legacy Dad worked so hard to build." It was a masterful move, framing her greed as concern, aligning her ambition with their father's memory. Liam grunted in agreement. "He's a farmer, Chloe, not a businessman. He'll run this place into the ground with his nostalgia." Chloe nodded, her expression one of deep, feigned sorrow. "Then we have to protect it," she whispered. "We have to protect Dad's legacy from him." The alliance was sealed, not in a contract, but in a shared glance of cold, calculated avarice, right there in the shadow of their dead father's empty chair. The three children, a vintner, a predator, and a puppeteer, were now set on their paths, and the sacred ground of Vaughan Estates was about to become their battlefield. The false peace that followed the reading of the will lasted precisely 4 days. It was a strained, suffocating quiet, the kind that precedes a lightning strike. The three siblings moved through the grand house like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, the unspoken words between them crackling in the air. Liam, ever the man of action, was the one to break the ceasefire. He sent a terse, impersonal email at 7 in the morning. Subject: Emergency Board Meeting. Location: Formal Dining Room. Time: 9 a.m. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The formal dining room was a place of memory, of boisterous holiday dinners and his father presiding over the head of the long, polished table. Using it for this purpose felt like a desecration. When he arrived, the scene was worse than he imagined. Liam had already set up a large digital screen at the head of the table where their father's chair sat empty. Charts and financial projections glowed on the screen, cold and blue in the morning light. Liam was all business, dressed in a crisp shirt, pacing with his phone to his ear. Chloe was seated to his right, nursing a cup of tea, her expression carefully neutral. She gave Ethan a small, apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes, a silent message that said, "I'm just a spectator here." A lie so blatant it was insulting. Liam didn't wait for pleasantries. He ended his call and launched directly into his presentation, his voice devoid of emotion, as if he were addressing a room full of strangers, not the brother and sister who shared his blood. "The numbers don't lie," he began, gesturing to a graph that showed flatlining profits over the past 3 years. "Vaughn Estates is stagnating. We're a legacy brand drowning in nostalgia. We're asset-rich and cash-poor. It's time for a paradigm shift." The corporate jargon flowed from him, a sterile river meant to wash away any emotional attachment. Then he clicked to the next slide, a satellite image of the property with a large red rectangle drawn around the oldest block of vines, the very place Ethan had sought solace just days before. "This," Liam said, his voice ringing with triumph, "is our primary untapped asset, the old vine block. It produces a critically acclaimed but low-yield wine that accounts for less than 5% of our revenue, yet it occupies 30% of our most valuable real estate." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Liam continued, "I've been in preliminary talks with the Sterling Hospitality Group. They're prepared to offer 9 figures for this parcel. They want to build a world-class luxury resort and spa. The sale would inject a massive amount of capital into the company, allowing us to—" Ethan didn't hear the rest. A roaring filled his ears. Sell the old vine block? It was unthinkable. It was like selling a piece of their father's heart for scrap metal. "No," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through Liam's monologue. Liam paused, visibly annoyed at the interruption. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Ethan repeated, standing up. "You can't sell that land. It's not just real estate, Liam. It's our history. Grandfather planted those vines with his bare hands. The wine from that block is the soul of this company. It's what makes us Vaughn Estates, and not some faceless corporation." Liam let out a short, humorless laugh. "The soul doesn't pay the bills, Ethan. And newsflash, we are a corporation. A corporation I intend to make profitable. That wine is a pet project, a vanity piece. We can't afford that kind of vanity anymore." He then outlined the rest of his vision, a brutal campaign of modernization. He wanted to triple their production of their cheaper table wine, which meant tearing out more of the older, more complex varietals, automating the harvesting process, which would put dozens of loyal workers out of a job, and sourcing cheaper grapes from outside the valley to cut costs. It was a plan to gut the company of its identity, to turn their father's art into a cheap commodity. "This is an insult to his memory," Ethan said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and grief. "Everything he stood for, everything he taught us, you want to burn it to the ground for a quick payday. He would have never approved of this." Liam's face hardened, his corporate mask slipping to reveal the raw contempt beneath. Dad was a romantic who almost ran this company into the ground. His refusal to adapt is why we're in this position. I'm not going to let his sentimentality ruin my inheritance. The words, "my inheritance," hung in the air, betraying his true feelings. He never saw them as partners. He saw them as obstacles. All eyes turned to Chloe. She had remained silent, watching, observing. This was her moment, her chance to be the tiebreaker, to honor their father's true legacy. "Chloe, please," Ethan implored. "You can't let him do this." Chloe placed her teacup down with a delicate click. She looked at Ethan, her eyes full of a carefully rehearsed sympathy. "Ethan, darling, my heart breaks hearing this. I remember having picnics with Daddy on that hill," she began, her voice soft and melodic. Ethan felt a flicker of hope. She remembered. "But," she continued, "and the flicker died. We have to be practical. Liam is right about the numbers. They are alarming. We're the board of a company now. We have a fiduciary duty. Perhaps there's a middle ground?" But she offered none. Her words were a smokescreen, a performance of reluctance to soften the blow of her inevitable betrayal. "I don't see any other way to secure the company's future," she finally said, looking at Liam. "We need the capital." She wouldn't look at Ethan. She couldn't. "So, let's make it official," Liam said, his voice sharp and victorious. "All in favor of the modernization and asset liquidation plan?" He raised his hand instantly. After a moment of dramatic hesitation, Chloe slowly, regretfully raised hers, 2 hands in the air. Ethan stood alone, his own hands clenched into fists at his sides. "The motion passes," Liam declared, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. He closed his laptop. The meeting was over. The first crack had appeared. It was not a hairline fracture. It was a chasm, deep and dark, that had just opened at Ethan's feet, separating him from everything he had ever known as family. The motion passing was not the end of the battle. It was the beginning of an occupation. In the weeks that followed, Liam and Chloe moved with a chilling efficiency. Their 2-vote majority, a weapon they wielded like a bludgeon against the soul of Vaughn Estates. The first casualties were the people. Ethan arrived at the winery one morning to find a small group of older workers gathered near the gates, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. Among them was Miguel, the vineyard manager, a man with skin like leather and hands that knew every vine on the property as if they were his own children. He had worked alongside Ethan's father for 40 years. Now, he was holding a small cardboard box with his personal effects, a security guard from a firm Ethan didn't recognize standing impassively nearby. "He says I'm redundant," Miguel said to Ethan, his voice thick with a pain that went far beyond losing a job. 40 years, and I am redundant." Ethan stormed into the main house and found Liam on the veranda, sipping an espresso and reviewing stock market data on his tablet. "What have you done?" Ethan demanded, his voice tight with fury. "You can't just fire Miguel. He is this vineyard." Liam didn't even look up. "He's a line item, Ethan. An expensive one. We're bringing in a new operations team with a focus on efficiency. It's called Progress." Ethan felt a surge of helpless rage. "You call this progress? Tossing away a man's life, his loyalty, for a few extra dollars on a spreadsheet?" Liam finally lowered his tablet, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "I call it running a business. Something you know nothing about. The decision is made. Don't make a scene." It was a purge. One by one, the old guard, the men and women who held the institutional memory of Vaughn Estates, were replaced by Liam's corporate yes-men. Each dismissal was a dagger in Ethan's heart, another thread cut from the tapestry his father had woven. The hypocrisy of it all was what truly sickened him. While Liam cited cost-cutting as the reason for shattering lives, the estate's expenses began to balloon in other, more personal ways. A gleaming silver Aston Martin appeared in the driveway, leased by the company as Liam's new executive vehicle. Chloe, meanwhile, announced a 2-week fact-finding mission to the luxury markets of Paris and Milan to analyze European branding strategies. Ethan saw the itinerary she'd carelessly left on a table, filled not with meetings, but with reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants and private shopping appointments at Chanel and Gucci. They were bleeding the company dry, using its coffers as their personal slush fund, all while claiming they were saving it from the brink of financial ruin. Their assault on Ethan was more insidious. They began a campaign of psychological warfare designed to isolate him and shatter his confidence. He was systematically excluded from important emails. Meetings concerning the future of the winery would be scheduled and rescheduled until he was unable to attend. When he did manage to voice an opinion, it was met with condescending smiles. Liam would often cut him off mid-sentence in front of new managers, saying things like, "Thank you, Ethan, for the historical perspective." Now let's talk about the 21st century. He was being rendered invisible, a ghost haunting his own legacy. His authority, once respected by everyone on the estate, was now a joke. He'd given instruction to the seller hands, only to have it countermanded an hour later by a memo from Liam's new operations manager. They were turning his passion into a prison, forcing him to watch as they dismantled his life's work and his father's dream. The cruelest blow came not from his siblings, but from his mother. Eleanor Vaughan had retreated into a cocoon of grief since her husband's death, floating through the grand house like a phantom, unwilling to confront the ugliness that was consuming her family. Desperate, Ethan went to her, hoping to find an ally, a last bastion of reason. He found her in the conservatory, surrounded by her prize-winning orchids. He laid it all out for her, his voice cracking with emotion, the firings, the grotesque spending, the sale of the old vine block. He begged her to intervene, to speak to Liam and Chloe. Eleanor listened, her face a mask of weary sorrow. When he was finished, she reached out and patted his hand, her touch as light and ineffective as a falling leaf. "Ethan, dear," she said, her voice distant. "I know this is hard for you, but you must try to understand. Your brother and sister are only doing what they think is best to save the company. They told me how dire the finances are." Ethan stared at her, horrified. "They told you?" "Mom, they're lying. They're draining the accounts for themselves." Her eyes clouded over, a deep, impenetrable sadness welling up. "That's a terrible thing to say," she whispered. "Liam is so worried. He says your grief is making you act difficult, that you're resisting the necessary changes. Please, Ethan, for your father's memory, don't cause any more conflict. Just try to get along." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. They had gotten to her. They had twisted the truth, painting him as an unstable, emotional obstacle. And she had believed them, because believing them was easier than facing the monstrous reality that 2 of her children were cannibals, devouring the family from the inside out. He had lost his last ally. He was completely, utterly alone, adrift in a sea of betrayal. He walked out of the conservatory, the sweet scent of the orchids suddenly cloying and suffocating, the beautiful flowers, a testament to a family that was all surface, with a rot that was spreading, unseen, at its very roots. The final illusion of family was stripped away on a Tuesday. By then, the transformation of Vaughan Estates was well underway. Surveyors with bright orange vests walked the hills of the old vine block, their presence a constant, throbbing wound on the landscape. Liam's new management team, a collection of cold-eyed men in identical gray suits, roamed the winery with clipboards, their whispers and sideways glances following Ethan like a shroud. He was no longer a partner or an owner. He was an exhibit in a museum they were about to tear down. The summons came, as it always did, via a cold email from Liam. This time, the meeting was back in their father's office, and the attendee list included a name Ethan didn't recognize. Julian Croft, Esquire, a litigator, a shark. Ethan knew then, before he even walked through the door, that this was the end. He found them waiting for him, a tribunal arrayed against him. Liam sat behind their father's desk, the picture of usurped authority. Chloe was perched elegantly on the corner of the desk, her posture relaxed but her eyes watchful. And seated in one of the leather armchairs was Julian Croft, a man whose expensive suit and predatory smile seemed to suck the very air out of the room. On the polished surface of the desk, between him and Liam, lay a thick, spiral-bound document. Its cover read, "Independent Audit and Performance Review, Vaughan Estates Oenology Division." It looked official, important, and final. "Ethan, thank you for coming," Liam began, his tone dripping with a false magnanimity that turned Ethan's stomach. "We have the final report from the auditors we hired to assess the financial health of the company. The results are deeply troubling." He slid the document across the desk. It stopped just short of Ethan's hands, a barrier between them. "I'll save you the trouble of reading all 200 pages. The executive summary is quite clear. Over the past 5 years, your division has been operating at a catastrophic loss. The report details a pattern of reckless inventory management, grossly inflated purchasing costs, and a complete failure to adhere to budgetary controls. Every word was a lie, a carefully crafted fiction, but it was printed in black and white, stamped with the seal of a supposedly impartial firm. Ethan felt a surreal sense of detachment, as if he were watching a play about his own execution. He looked from the report to his brother's face, searching for any flicker of doubt, any hint of conscience. He found none. There was only the cold, hard glint of victory. "The auditors estimate," Liam continued, his voice like a judge passing sentence, "that your mismanagement has cost the company millions in potential revenue and direct losses. It's a miracle the entire enterprise didn't collapse under the weight of it." Chloe then slid off the desk and came toward him, her face a perfect mask of sorrowful empathy. It was the most monstrous performance he had ever witnessed. "We don't want to do this, Ethan," she said, her voice a silken whisper. "It breaks our hearts to even think about it. But the numbers are what they are. We can't ignore a finding this severe. The board. We have a legal responsibility." She placed a hand on his shoulder, and he had to fight the urge to recoil as if from a venomous snake. "That's why we wanted to talk to you first. Privately. As family." She let the word family hang in the air, a grotesque perversion of its meaning. "We are offering you a way out of this mess. A chance to leave with your dignity intact." Liam leaned forward, all pretense of warmth gone. "Here is our offer. We will buy out your 1/3 share. Given the damage your division has caused, its value is significantly impaired. But, out of the goodness of our hearts, we are prepared to offer you $500,000. A clean break." Ethan almost laughed. The sum was a joke, an insult. His share was worth 50 times that, at least. It wasn't a buyout, it was hush money. It was the price they were willing to pay for his silence and his disappearance. The lawyer, Julian Croft, spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and dangerous. "And I would advise you to consider the offer very carefully, Mr. Vaughn, because if you decline, the alternative island, unpleasant." Liam picked up the thread. "If you refuse, we, as the majority shareholders, will vote to remove you from the board and terminate your employment for gross negligence. Mr. Croft will then be instructed to initiate a civil lawsuit against you to recoup the damages outlined in this report. We will sue you for everything you have and everything you ever will have. Your name, the name you share with our father, will be dragged through every vineyard and every newspaper in this valley. By the time we are done, you won't be able to get a job sweeping floors in a tasting room." There it was, the final, brutal stab in the back. It was so perfectly choreographed, so utterly ruthless. The fabricated report was their weapon, the lowball offer was the pretense of mercy, and the threat of total annihilation was the force to ensure his compliance. He looked at his brother, the corporate raider who saw family as just another asset to be stripped. He looked at his sister, the socialite serpent whose smile concealed a heart of pure poison. And in that moment, something inside Ethan broke. It was not his spirit, but the last, fragile thread of hope he had clung to, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that somewhere deep down, they were still the siblings he'd grown up with. That delusion evaporated, burned away by the cold fire of their ambition. They weren't his family anymore. They were strangers wearing familiar faces. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, he didn't plead. He was a man standing on a cliff's edge as the ground crumbled beneath him. There was nothing to say. There was nothing to do. He slowly rose to his feet, the report and the offer sitting on the desk like a tombstone. He looked his brother and sister in the eyes, one last time, and what he saw there confirmed everything. There was no love, no regret, only the chilling emptiness of their victory. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving them to their spoils, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, a sound of absolute finality. For 2 days, Ethan existed in a fog of silent, suffocating despair. The buyout agreement sat on the worn wooden table in his cottage, its crisp, white pages, a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of his life. It felt less like a legal document and more like a death certificate for his past, his future, and the very concept of family. He would pick up a pen, its weight heavy in his hand, and stare at the signature line. All it would take was a simple scrawl of his name, and the pain would be over. He could take the insulting sum of money and simply vanish, become a ghost, another casualty of the Vaughn dynasty. He could let the memory of his father be paved over by a luxury resort, let his home be run by the soulless men in gray suits. It would be an end. And in his exhaustion, his soul-deep weariness, an end felt merciful. He was a man who knew how to nurture life from the soil, but he had no idea how to fight monsters who wore the faces of his own blood. He was ready to surrender. But on the third day, as he picked up the pen one last time, a different thought took hold. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was a stubborn, flickering ember of pride. If he was going to sign away his birthright, if he was going to formally consent to the erasure of his father's legacy, he would not do it alone in his cottage like a coward. He would do it in the presence of the last man on earth who truly knew what that legacy meant. He would grant Liam and Chloe their victory, but he would have a final, dignified witness to his defeat. He put the unsigned papers into a folder and drove his old pickup truck into town, to the quiet, oak-lined street where Mr. Davies had maintained his law practice for 50 years. The office was a world away from the cold, glass, and steel aesthetic of Liam's new corporate lawyers. It smelled of old paper, leather-bound books, and the faint, sweet scent of the pipe tobacco Arthur Vaughn himself used to smoke. It was a room built on handshakes and integrity, a relic from another time. Mr. Davies greeted him not with a handshake, but with a sad, knowing look in his tired eyes. He gestured for Ethan to sit, his movements slow and deliberate. "I was wondering when I might see you," the old lawyer said, his voice a gentle rumble. Ethan didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid the folder across the antique desk. "They've made me an offer," Ethan said, his own voice sounding hollow and distant to his ears. "I'm here to sign it. I thought it should be notarized by you, for old time's sake." Mr. Davies opened the folder and slowly read the first page. He didn't flinch, but a deep sigh escaped his lips, a sound of profound disappointment. He looked up at Ethan, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "This isn't an offer, son. It's an execution." He closed the folder and pushed it back toward Ethan. "And you are not the man your father raised if you think you're going to sign it." Ethan felt a flash of anger. "What choice do I have? They have a report, a legal team. They'll ruin me." Mr. Davies leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. "Your father was the shrewdest man I ever knew. He was a romantic, yes, but he was no fool. He loved all his children, Ethan, but he wasn't blind. He saw the fire in Liam's ambition. He saw the cold calculation behind Chloe's charm. He saw it all. And Arthur Vaughn never, ever left his flank unguarded." The lawyer's words were cryptic, but they were spoken with such conviction that they pierced through Ethan's fog of defeat. Mr. Davies then rose slowly from his chair and walked to a tall filing cabinet in the corner of the room. From a bottom drawer, he pulled out a simple, dark wood box, about the size of a shoebox, covered in a thin layer of dust. The initials, A.V., were elegantly burned into the lid. He placed the box on the desk between them with a soft, resonant thud. "Your father left this with me about a year before he passed," Mr. Davies said, his voice now softer. "He told me it contained some personal effects, things of sentimental value. He said it was for you, and he gave me a very specific instruction. He said, 'Give this to Ethan, but only at a time when he feels like he has truly lost.' I'd say that time has come, wouldn't you?" Ethan stared at the box. It was a completely unexpected artifact from a life that felt like it had ended. "What is it?" he asked. "As I said, personal effects," Mr. Davies replied, his face a careful, neutral mask. He was a lawyer, and he was walking a very fine line. He just said it might help you remember the kind of man he was. A man who always planned for the future, who always protected what was his. "My advice, as your father's friend, not as your lawyer, is this. Go home, look through that box, and then decide if you still want to sign those papers." He stood up, signaling the end of their meeting. Ethan, feeling dazed and utterly confused, took the box. It had a surprising weight to it. He had come to this office to find an ending, to finalize his surrender. Instead, he was leaving with a mystery from the past. He walked out into the afternoon sun, the unsigned papers still in his folder, the wooden box clutched in his hands. He didn't feel hope, not yet. But for the first time in months, he felt something other than the crushing weight of defeat. He felt a flicker of curiosity. A single, puzzling question mark had just been placed at the end of his story's final, grim sentence. Ethan drove back to the estate with the wooden box on the passenger seat, its silent presence filling the cab of his truck. He didn't open it right away. He carried it into his cottage and placed it in the center of his table, right next to the hateful buyout agreement. For the rest of the day, he simply looked at it, circling it as if it were a sleeping animal that might bite. He was terrified of what was inside. He feared it was just a box of old memories, a sentimental trap laid by a well-meaning old man that would only deepen his grief and make his surrender more painful. Hope, he thought, was a crueler torment than despair. It wasn't until late that night, with the rain once again whispering against the window panes and the house steeped in a profound silence, that he finally found the courage to open it. The lid lifted with a soft sigh of old wood. The contents were not what he expected. There were no legal documents, no hidden ledgers. It was a time capsule of his father's soul. He carefully lifted each item out, the scent of old paper and dried tobacco filling the air. There was his father's first corkscrew, its handle worn smooth with a lifetime of use. There was a single, perfectly preserved grapevine leaf pressed between the pages of a small, leather-bound book of poetry. Ethan opened the book and saw his father's familiar, elegant handwriting on the inside cover, a quote from Rumi. "Raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder." There was a faded black and white photograph of his parents on their wedding day, looking impossibly young and full of a hope that now seemed tragic. Tucked in the corner was a silver dollar from 1958, the year of his father's first successful harvest. Ethan held the cold, heavy coin in his palm, each object a testament to a man who valued legacy over currency, growth over noise. This was the father he remembered, not the ruthless titan Liam described. A wave of profound sorrow washed over him. Mr. Davies was wrong. This wasn't a weapon, it was a funeral. And then he saw it, nestled in a bed of faded velvet at the bottom of the box, his father's pen. It was a vintage Mont Blanc, its black resin body cool and solid, its silver clip worn from decades of being slid in and out of his father's jacket pocket. Arthur Vaughan had signed every important document of his life with this pen, from the deed to their first acre of land to the birth certificates of his 3 children. Ethan picked it up, its familiar weight, a comfort in his hand. He ran his thumb over the small, mother-of-pearl star on its cap, and for a moment he could almost feel his father's presence in the room. He idly began to unscrew the body of the pen, a nervous habit, expecting to see the empty ink cartridge inside. But it felt different, stiffer, and there was a faint, dry rattle. His curiosity piqued. He twisted harder. It came apart not at the normal seam, but at the base of the barrel, revealing a hidden compartment. And there, tucked inside a tiny cylinder of felt, was a small, exquisitely crafted key. It was brass, with an ornate head and a complex, jagged tooth. It was unlike any key Ethan had ever seen. It was certainly not for any door on the estate. It was a key for a secret. His mind began to race, pushing through the fog of his grief. A key for what? He thought back, sifting through years of memories. He remembered his father's routines, his habits. And then, a faint, almost forgotten memory surfaced. His father used to make occasional, solitary trips into the city. He never said where he was going, just that he had old business to attend to. And he always went to a specific part of downtown, to the old financial district, where the buildings were made of marble and granite, not glass and steel. It was where the city's old money was kept. There was a bank there, the Sterling Merchant Trust, a discreet institution that had been there for a century, a different bank from the one that handled the estate's corporate accounts. On a hunch, a wild, desperate surge of something that felt dangerously like hope, Ethan knew that's where he had to go. The next morning, he was on the road before the sun had fully risen. The drive to the city was a blur, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, the strange little key heavy in his pocket. He was no longer a victim reacting to his siblings' attacks. He was an agent in his own story, on a quest set for him by the ghost of his father. The Sterling Merchant Trust was even more imposing than he remembered, a temple of wealth and silence. His boots echoed on the marble floor. With a trembling hand, he presented the key to a stern-faced clerk who inspected it, then him, before nodding curtly and leading him through a series of gates into the vault. The air grew cold, thick with the weight of 1,000 secrets locked in steel. The clerk retrieved a long, thin metal box and placed it on a small table in a private viewing room, leaving Ethan alone. His heart was pounding against his ribs. He inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. He lifted the lid. There was no gold, no cash, no bearer bonds. The box contained only two things: a single, thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with the familiar Vaughn family crest in dark red wax, and lying on top of it, a handwritten letter, the envelope bearing a single word written in his father's unmistakable script: Ethan. He sank into the chair, his hands shaking as he picked up the letter. This was it. This was the reason for the key, the box, the trip. With a deep breath that did little to calm his racing heart, he broke the wax seal and unfolded the pages within, ready to hear his father's voice one last time. He sat in the chilling silence of the bank's viewing room, the thick, cream-colored paper trembling slightly in his hands. The letter was dated just 6 months before his father's death. The handwriting was as familiar as his own, yet the words it formed were from a man Ethan had only ever glimpsed in moments of quiet reflection. This was not Arthur Vaughn, the titan of industry, but Arthur the father, the husband, the man, in his final, unvarnished confession. "My dearest Ethan," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has proven to be as disappointing as I feared. I am writing this because I cannot bear the thought of leaving you unarmed in a battle I know is coming. I love all my children, do not ever doubt that. I love Liam for his fierce ambition, the same fire that once burned in me. I love Chloe for her charm, for the light she could bring into a room. But a fire untended can burn a house down, and a charming light can blind a person to the truth. I have watched them, my son. I have seen the hunger in their eyes turn from ambition to avarice. I have seen their love of family curdle into a love of status. It is the great failure of my life that my wealth, which I hoped would be a foundation for them, has instead become a poison in their veins." Ethan had to pause, a single hot tear tracing a path down his cheek. He could feel his father's anguish in every word, in the slight tremor of the ink. He continued reading. "I have left a simple will for the world to see, a will that declares you all equals. It is a lie. It is a test. I am giving Liam and Chloe the chance to do the right thing, to prove my fears wrong, to choose family over fortune, but in my heart, I do not believe they will. That is where you, and the document that accompanies this letter, come in. You, Ethan, are the only one who inherited my love for the land, for the process, for the soul of this place. You are the only one who understands that our true legacy is not in our bank account, but in the quality of the wine and the integrity of our name. That is why I must burden you with this. It is a terrible thing to ask a son to be a judge of his own siblings, but you are the last line of defense for everything I ever truly valued." Beneath the letter was the codicil. It was a formal legal document, dense with the precise, unforgiving language of the law. Ethan read it once, then twice, the full, breathtaking audacity of his father's plan slowly dawning on him. It was a masterpiece of strategic foresight. The document, which legally superseded the primary will, contained a single, devastating clause. He came to know it as the morality clause. It stipulated that if any heir or heirs were found by the executor of the estate to have engaged in actions of malicious intent against another heir, or to have acted in a manner that deliberately and fundamentally undermines the founding principles and established reputation of Vaughn estates, their claim to any inheritance would be rendered immediately and irrevocably void. The power to make this determination was vested solely and absolutely in the hands of one man, Mr. Davies. Upon the enactment of the clause, the forfeited shares would not be dissolved, but would pass in their entirety to the remaining heir who had, in the executor's judgment, acted in good faith and with loyalty to the family's true legacy. Ethan leaned back in the cold, leather chair, the documents resting in his lap. The air in the vault, which had felt so oppressive and tomb-like, now seemed to crackle with a sudden, electric clarity. The grief that had clouded his mind for months, the heavy cloak of despair and helplessness, was burned away in an instant. It was replaced by something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a cold, diamond, hard certainty. His father had not abandoned him to the wolves. He had laid a perfect, patient trap and had just handed Ethan the key. He finally understood. This was never supposed to be a fair fight. He wasn't meant to reason with Liam or appeal to Chloe's conscience. They had none. He wasn't meant to argue with them in boardrooms or counter their lies. He was meant to let them believe they had already won. His father's genius was not in creating a weapon for Ethan to attack with, but in creating a mirror that would force his siblings to destroy themselves. Their greed, their cruelty, their lies, the fraudulent report, the firings of loyal men, the lowball offer, these were not just acts of betrayal. They were evidence. They were the charges they were levying against themselves. All Ethan had to do was document it. A profound shift occurred within him in the silence of that room. The wounded, sentimental artist died, and a quiet, calculating strategist was born. This was no longer about hurt feelings or a stolen birthright. This was about justice, a slow, methodical, and righteous justice his father had orchestrated from beyond the grave. His mission was suddenly crystal clear. He had to play the part of the defeated brother. He had to let them get comfortable, arrogant, and careless. He had to gather every piece of paper, every email, every invoice, every testimony from a disgruntled former employee. He would build a case so thorough, so irrefutable, that when he finally presented it to Mr. Davies, it would not be an accusation, it would be a verdict they had already written themselves. He carefully folded the letter and the codicil, placing them back in the envelope and sealing it in his inside jacket pocket. He walked out of the viewing room, leaving the empty safe deposit box behind. He nodded to the clerk, his expression calm and unreadable. He stepped out of the bank's marble halls and into the bright, chaotic afternoon sunlight of the city. The world looked different, sharper. He was no longer a ghost in his own life. He was a hunter, and the hunt had just begun. Returning to Vaughan Estates was like entering a foreign country where he was a wanted man. The air was thick with a triumphant hostility. But Ethan was no longer the man who had left Mr. Davies's office. The grief was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but it was now encased in a glacier of pure, unyielding purpose. He had a mission, and the first step was to become the most convincing actor in the Napa Valley. He found Liam and Chloe in their father's office, reviewing architectural renderings for the proposed luxury resort, their heads bent together over the desk in a picture of conspiratorial intimacy. They looked up as he entered, their expressions guarded, expecting another outburst, another futile appeal to a sentiment they did not possess. They were not prepared for the man who stood before them. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were downcast, and the fire that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated calm. He looked, for all intents and purposes, like a broken man. He stopped before the desk, not taking a seat, and placed the buyout agreement on the polished wood. "I've thought about it," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "I've read the report. You were right. I was. Too emotional, too caught up in the past." Liam leaned back in the chair, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across his face. He had won. Chloe's expression softened into one of pity, a disgusting, theatrical display that made Ethan's skin crawl. "Oh, Ethan," she cooed. "We knew you'd see reason." Ethan just nodded, keeping his eyes on the floor. "I'll sign," he said, "but this is my entire life, my birthright. I can't just sign it away on a Tuesday. I need a little time to let my own lawyer review the paperwork. It's just a formality to make sure my interests are protected in the transition. A week, maybe 2. It was the perfect request. It was reasonable, logical, and it reeked of capitulation. A man fighting a war doesn't ask for time to review the surrender terms. He just fights. Liam, eager to finalize his coup, saw no threat in it. "Fine," he said, waving a dismissive hand. 2 weeks. Have your lawyer call Croft. But don't try anything clever, Ethan. The deal is the deal. "I won't," Ethan said, and it was the truest lie he had ever told. That night, his small cottage transformed from a place of mourning into a silent war room. While the main house slept, cocooned in its ill-gotten luxury, Ethan worked. His first move was to reach out to Sarah, a junior accountant his father had hired straight out of college. She was sharp, discreet, and had worshipped Arthur. Ethan knew she was disgusted by Liam's new regime. He met her at a small, dark coffee shop miles away from the valley. He didn't show her the codicil. He didn't have to. He simply told her he had reason to believe Liam and Chloe were misusing company funds and that he needed to protect his father's legacy. That was enough. That night, a password-protected file appeared in his inbox. It contained everything. He spent hours, fueled by black coffee and a cold rage, meticulously going through the digital records. The evidence was more damning than he could have imagined. There were the unredacted expense reports from Chloe's research trip to Europe, a breathtaking ledger of 5-star hotels, haute couture boutiques, and private car services, all billed to the company. There were Liam's invoices for the Aston Martin, for his memberships to exclusive golf clubs, even for a $5,000 bottle of scotch, all filed under client entertainment. He downloaded and encrypted everything, creating multiple backups. This was the proof of their financial gluttony. Next, he needed proof of their conspiracy. This was harder. He suspected their most incriminating conversations would be in deleted emails. Sarah gave him the name of a freelance cybersecurity expert, a digital ghost who operated in the gray areas of the law. Ethan paid him in cash. 2 days later, another file arrived. It was a goldmine. There were the emails between Liam and the auditing firm, with Liam's explicit instructions to focus on the negative fiscal impact of the Oenology division and to construct a narrative of mismanagement. It was a written confession of fraud. Even more damning were the fragments of deleted text messages between Liam and Chloe recovered from a server backup. Chloe to Liam. "He's too sentimental. We have to be firm." Liam to Chloe. "The report will give us all the leverage we need to force him out. The lawyer says it's ironclad." They had not only built their own gallows, they had kept the blueprints. He then drove to the modest homes of the men who had been fired. He spoke with Miguel, with the cellar master, with the head of harvesting. He recorded their stories, their pain, and their shock at being discarded after decades of loyalty. He had them sign affidavits, their sworn testimonies a powerful human counterpoint to Liam's cold financial lies. While Ethan built his arsenal in the shadows, Liam and Chloe grew more brazen in the light. They believed they had won, that Ethan was a neutered threat, a ghost already fading from view. Their arrogance swelled to magnificent proportions. They fast-tracked the deal with the Sterling Hospitality Group, signing preliminary contracts without a full board review. They paraded architects and interior designers through the main house, loudly discussing plans to gut their father's traditional decor in favor of a cold, minimalist aesthetic. Their hubris reached its apex one evening on the veranda. Ethan watched from the shadows of his cottage as Chloe, swirling a glass of champagne, unveiled her grandest idea. "Darling," she said to Liam, her voice carrying on the still night air, "a victory this total deserves a celebration. A declaration. We should throw a party, a massive one, invite everyone, the investors, the critics, the entire social register of the valley. We'll announce the resort deal, unveil the new branding. It won't be a party, it will be a coronation." Liam's answering laugh was loud and triumphant. The idea appealed to his immense ego perfectly, a public spectacle to consecrate his reign. They would call it the Vaughn Estates. The New Dawn Party. Ethan stepped back from the window, a slow, cold smile touching his lips for the first time in months. A coronation, it was perfect. They were so blinded by their own brilliance they couldn't see the truth. They weren't planning a party to celebrate their victory. They were building the perfect stage for their own execution. And all the key players would have a front row seat. The night of the party was a spectacle of breathtaking arrogance. The old stone facade of the Vaughn family home, a place that had always embodied a quiet, earthy elegance, was garishly lit with purple and gold uplighting, making it look like a cheap hotel. A valet service, staffed by young men in crisp tuxedos, parked a seemingly endless line of gleaming German sedans and Italian sports cars. Inside, the main hall was unrecognizable. The comfortable, antique furniture had been replaced with sleek, white lounge chairs and tall, chrome cocktail tables. A string quartet sawed away at a passionless, minimalist tune that was the antithesis of the jazz and blues Arthur Vaughan had loved. The air, which should have smelled of old wood and history, was thick with the competing scents of expensive perfume and truffle oil from the endless trays of canapes. It was a party celebrating the death of a legacy, and the guests were dancing on its grave. At the center of it all were the new king and queen, Liam and Chloe. Liam was in his element, a shark in a perfectly tailored suit, gliding through the crowd with a glass of champagne permanently in his hand. He accepted congratulations from investors and backslaps from the developers of the Sterling Hospitality Group, his voice booming with a conqueror's confidence. Chloe was a vision in a shimmering, backless gown, her laughter tinkling as she charmed wine critics and local dignitaries. They were a portrait of success, the golden children who had taken their father's stagnant company and were rocketing it into the future. They looked invincible. And then there was Ethan. He arrived not through the grand main entrance, but through a side door from the gardens, slipping into the throng almost unnoticed. He wore a simple, dark, well-cut suit, a stark contrast to the flash and glitter around him. He took no champagne, ate no food. He simply stood near the French doors that led to the veranda, a silent, watchful presence. His calmness was unnerving. It was not the defeated, hollow look he had worn for the past 2 weeks. It was something else, a deep, placid stillness, like the surface of an ocean before a tsunami. Chloe spotted him first and drifted over, her smile a masterpiece of condescension. "Ethan, darling, I'm so glad you came," she purred. "I was worried you'd be too upset to join us." Liam joined her, clapping Ethan on the shoulder with a force that was more of a blow than a friendly gesture. "Good to see you, little brother," he boomed. "Decided to come see what a real vision looks like? Take notes. This is how you run an empire." Ethan met his brother's triumphant gaze, his own expression unreadable. "I wouldn't have missed this for the world," he said, his voice quiet and even. "I'm here to see our father's legacy properly honored." Liam laughed, mistaking the words for a final, pathetic surrender. "That's the spirit. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe it's time for the main event." A small, temporary stage had been set up at one end of the hall. Liam strode toward it, taking a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter. A hush fell over the room as he tapped the microphone. The moment had arrived. His coronation. "Friends, colleagues, partners," he began, his voice amplified throughout the hall. "Welcome, welcome to the new dawn of Vaughan Estates. For too long, this company has rested on its laurels, content to live in the past. But the future does not wait for sentiment. The future rewards boldness, vision, and the courage to make difficult decisions. And that is what we have done." He raised his glass, a smug, self-satisfied smile on his face. "So I would like to propose a toast. To the future, to progress, to..." He never finished the sentence. The grand, oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a slow, deliberate weight that cut through his speech. All heads turned. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Davies. He was not dressed for a party. He wore a severe, dark gray suit, and his face was grim, etched with a profound seriousness. He was flanked by a younger associate who carried a heavy, leather briefcase. The music from the string quartet faltered and died. The celebratory chatter evaporated, replaced by a wave of confused whispers. Mr. Davies's presence here, at this time, was a jarring anomaly. He strode into the room, his polished black shoes echoing on the floor, his gaze fixed on the stage. He did not stop until he was standing at the foot of the small podium, looking directly up at Liam, whose face was a mask of disbelief and fury. "What is the meaning of this, Davies?" Liam hissed, his voice dangerously low. "This is a private event, Mr. Davies' voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried a chilling authority that commanded the attention of every person in the room. "Mr. Vaughn, I sincerely apologize for this public interruption. However, before your toast continues, there is a pressing and final matter concerning the estate of your father that must be addressed." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was better than gossip. This was live, high-stakes drama. Liam's face flushed a dark, angry red. "Whatever it is, it can wait until morning. Now get out." "I'm afraid," Mr. Davies said, his voice as unyielding as granite, "that it cannot wait." He then turned his body slightly, addressing not just Liam, but the entire silent room. "By the authority vested in me as the sole executor of the last will and testament of Arthur Franklin Vaughn, and in the presence of all three named beneficiaries, Liam Vaughn, Chloe Vaughn, and Ethan Vaughn, I am hereby calling an emergency and binding session of the Board of Vaughn Estates, effective immediately." The declaration was a thunderclap in the silent hall. It was a move of such breathtaking audacity that for a moment, no one moved. They were trapped. In front of their investors, their peers, and the media, Liam and Chloe could not refuse. The stage Liam had built for his coronation had just been turned into a courtroom. The guests were no longer a celebratory audience, they were a jury. And from the back of the room, Ethan Vaughn watched, his face perfectly, terrifyingly calm. The trap, at long last, had been sprung. The great hall of Vaughn Estates, moments before a stage for a coronation, was now a silent courtroom. The air was thick, with a tension so profound it was almost impossible to breathe. The shocked guests, trapped by a combination of morbid curiosity and social paralysis, stood like statues, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. On the stage, Liam's face was a grotesque mask of fury and confusion, his authority stripped from him in an instant. Chloe stood beside him, her practiced smile gone, replaced by a waxen, terrified pallor. All power in the room now emanated from the calm, grim figure of Mr. Davies, who stood before them like a specter of their father's conscience. "As this is now a formal meeting of the board," Mr. Davies announced, his voice cutting through the silence, "we will require the use of your presentation equipment, Liam." Before Liam could sputter a protest, Davies' young associate had already connected a laptop to the large screen. The celebratory logo for Vaughn Estates. The new dawn vanished, replaced by a simple, black screen. "The matter before the board," Davies continued, his tone methodical and devoid of emotion, "is a formal review of the conduct of the majority shareholders, Mr. Liam Vaughn and Miss Chloe Vaughn, since they assumed their roles." Liam found his voice, a strangled bellow of rage. "This is insane. You have no right. I'll have you disbarred." "Mr. Davies ignored him completely. "Let's begin with a review of corporate expenditures." On the screen, a document appeared. It was Chloe's American Express statement from her research trip, meticulously itemized. The names on the receipts flashed one by one for the entire room to see. Chanel, Dior, Bulgari. Private suites at the Four Seasons George V in Paris. A 5-figure dinner at a restaurant with 3 Michelin stars. Next to it, Davies' associate displayed a second document. The termination notice for Miguel, the vineyard manager of 40 years, citing necessary cost-saving measures. The hypocrisy was so stark, so vulgar, that a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Chloe looked as if she had been slapped. "Those were legitimate business expenses," she stammered, her voice thin and unconvincing. "Exhibit B," Mr. Davies said, and the screen changed. It now showed the company lease agreement for Liam's Aston Martin. Beside it, the severance pay, a pittance, for the 20 seller hands who had been laid off. "A necessary executive vehicle, I presume?" Davies asked dryly. Liam's face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. "This is slander. Our expenses are perfectly normal for a corporation of this size." "Are they?" Mr. Davies countered. Is it also normal to conspire to fraudulently devalue the company's assets in order to force a minority shareholder out? The screen changed again. An email from Liam to the head of the auditing firm appeared, its text enlarged for all to see. The damning phrase was highlighted in red. It is imperative that your final report emphasizes a narrative of significant mismanagement within the winemaking division. It was a smoking gun, a confession of fraud, in Liam's own words. The CEO of the auditing firm, who was standing near the front, turned pale and began to back away slowly into the crowd. Chloe began to sob, a desperate, theatrical display. "This is Ethan," she cried, pointing a trembling finger at her brother, who had not moved from his spot at the back of the room. "He's twisted everything. He's poisoned you against us because he was jealous." "Then perhaps you can explain this," Mr. Davies said, his voice dropping a note, becoming even colder. A new image filled the screen. It was the text message Chloe had sent to Liam. "He's too sentimental. We have to be firm." And Liam's reply, "The report will give us all the leverage we need to force him out. The lawyer says it's ironclad. Their plot, their own words hung in the air, condemning them more completely than any accusation ever could. The denials died on their lips. There was nowhere left for them to hide. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were staring, their expressions a mixture of shock, disgust, and glee. They were witnessing the social execution of the year. It was only then, in the suffocating silence of their guilt, that Mr. Davies allowed his associate to open the heavy leather briefcase. He took out a single, thick document, bound in a dark blue cover and sealed with wax. He held it up for all to see. "When Arthur Vaughan wrote his will," Miss Davies announced, his voice now resonating with the full weight of his purpose, "he knew the frailties of the human heart. He feared that his legacy of hard work could be destroyed by greed, which is why he prepared a contingency, a final, binding addendum to his will, a codicil." He broke the seal and began to read from the document, his voice the very instrument of Arthur's posthumous judgment. "I hereby decree that should any heir to my estate be found to have acted with malicious intent against another heir, or to have deliberately acted in a manner that compromises the integrity, reputation, and founding principles upon which Vaughan Estates was built, their claim to their inheritance shall be rendered immediately and irrevocably null and void." He paused, letting the words sink in. He then looked up from the page, his gaze sweeping over Liam and Chloe, who stood as if turned to stone. "As the sole executor of the estate, the final judgment falls to me, and based on the irrefutable evidence of financial malfeasance, conspiracy, and fraud presented here tonight, a case brought to my attention by Mr. Ethan Vaughan, I find that you, Liam Vaughan, and you, Chloe Vaughan, have profoundly and willfully violated the terms of your father's trust." He took a deep breath and delivered the final, devastating blow. "Therefore, by the power vested in me by the final will and testament of Arthur Franklin Vaughan, I declare your inheritance, your positions on this board, and all your claims to this estate to be, as of this moment, utterly and completely forfeited." The world crashed down around Liam and Chloe. A cacophony of gasps, of frantic whispers, erupted. The flashes of a dozen phone cameras began to strobe, capturing their humiliation for eternity. Liam let out an incoherent roar of fury, lunging forward as if to attack the old lawyer, only to be held back by the very security guards he had hired. Chloe simply crumpled, sinking to the floor of the stage in a heap of shimmering fabric and broken ambition, her sobs now real, racking, and hopeless. Their friends, their investors, their society allies, began to melt away into the night, abandoning the sinking ship with practiced speed. And through it all, Ethan watched. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply looked at the wreckage of his brother and sister, not with triumph, but with a deep, sorrowful finality. The war was over. Justice had been served. But looking at their shattered forms, he understood the terrible, tragic price of his victory. The fallout from that night was biblical. The New Dawn Party became the stuff of legend in the valley, a story of hubris and downfall that would be whispered over glasses of wine for decades to come. Liam and Chloe Vaughan were not just disinherited, they were socially annihilated. Their photographs, taken in their moment of utter humiliation, were splashed across society blogs and financial news sites. The investors they had courted abandoned them. The friends they had charmed now crossed the street to avoid them. They had flown too close to the sun on wings of greed and arrogance, and in a single, spectacular evening, they had been melted down to nothing. They vanished from the estate, their lavish belongings packed away in disgrace, leaving behind only the lingering stain of their ambition. Liam, it was rumored, had fled to some obscure country with what little personal money he had left, while Chloe had a nervous breakdown and was checked into a private wellness clinic on the East Coast. They became ghosts, haunting the edges of a world that no longer wanted them. In their absence, a new and reluctant king was crowned. The entirety of the Vaughan Estates empire, its lands, its winery, its vast fortune, now belonged to one man, Ethan. The remaining employees looked to him with a mixture of awe and expectation. The industry watched, waiting to see what the quiet, artistic son would do with such absolute power. Everyone assumed he would restore the old ways, that he would take his rightful place in his father's office and rule the kingdom he had so righteously won. For 2 weeks, the estate held its breath. Ethan remained in his small cottage, speaking to no one but Mr. Davies. And then, he called a press conference. He didn't hold it in the grand, tainted hall of the main house. Instead, he gathered the reporters and local media in the vineyard, amidst the gnarled, ancient vines of the old vine block, the very land that had been the catalyst for the entire war. He stood before them, not behind a podium, but on the rich, dark soil itself. He was not dressed as a CEO, but in simple, clean work clothes. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, yet it carried with a profound clarity over the rustling leaves. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know you're here to ask about the future of Vaughan Estates. You want to know about my new vision, my business plan, my strategy for growth." He paused, looking out over the rows of vines, his father's true legacy. "And I am here to tell you that I have none of those things, because as of today, I am renouncing my ownership of Vaughan Estates." A stunned silence fell over the assembled press. This was not the story they had come for. Ethan continued, his voice now filled with a deep, resonant emotion. "This company, this land, it was my father's dream. But the wealth it created became a sickness. It poisoned my family. It turned brother against sister, and it almost destroyed the very soul of this place. I fought to save my father's legacy, and I have come to realize that I cannot do that by becoming another king on the same broken throne." "My father's true legacy," Ethan said, his voice ringing with conviction, "is not the name on the bottle. It is the integrity in the bottle. It's the loyalty of the men and women who prune these vines in the winter frost and harvest these grapes under the hot summer Sunday. It is a love of the land and a respect for the community. And a legacy like that cannot be owned. It can only be stewarded." He then laid out his real plan, the one forged in the quiet of his cottage. Vaughan Estates would be placed into a trust. The company itself would be reorganized into an employee-owned cooperative with long-term staff, like the recently rehired Miguel, forming the new board of directors. The people who bled and sweated for the vineyard would now own it. Furthermore, the majority of the profits, in perpetuity, would be diverted into a new foundation, the Arthur Vaughan Legacy Fund, dedicated to providing agricultural scholarships and financial support to small, independent farms throughout the valley. As for himself, he would not be taking a single dollar. In the fight for a crown, the victors often find that what they truly wanted was not the throne, but freedom from its weight. Ethan had won the war, and his first and only act as king was to abdicate, to dismantle the prize his siblings had destroyed themselves to obtain. He had not just taken their inheritance, he had rendered the entire concept of it meaningless. That was his true, final justice. Never underestimate the quiet of a man who has endured too much, for when he finally moves, he does not seek revenge. He seeks to restore balance. The last time anyone saw Ethan Vaughan, he was walking away from the press conference, leaving the stunned reporters to scramble for a story far bigger than they had anticipated. He didn't return to the main house or even to his cottage. He walked to his old pickup truck, got in, and simply drove away, down the long gravel road that led off the property. He had nothing but the clothes on his back and a future he was now free to write for himself. He had saved his father's soul, not by seizing power, but by letting it go. He was no longer a Vaughn of Vaughn Estates. He was just Ethan. And for the first time in his life, he was completely and gloriously free. And every family has a secret waiting to be told. Join me for the next story.